right. So, welcome to the first session of the Better Citizens, Better World event. My name is Hannah, and I work for Churches for Middle East Peace. I am really excited about this event. We have so many good sessions coming up today. So, our first session, not just today, but over the next few days, we have so many good sessions. Our first session right now is a theological mandate for active citizenship, and it is going to be presented by Rick Barry. And Rick is the co-founder and executive director for the Center for Christian Civics, where he helps ministry leaders apply missionary theology to questions of civic engagement and public discipleship. His principled, empathetic focus on witness, humility, and spiritual formation makes him a uniquely encouraging voice on questions of political polarization and church health. Before launching Christian Civics, Rick worked as a political and nonprofit communications professional, first as a script, speech, and copywriter, then as a communications strategist. He has worked on campaigns for local, state, and federal offices and served as the in-house writer and editor for Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City and oversaw communications for Grace DC Church Network. And he also served on the advisory board for Pepperdine University's Institute for Public Service and Policy Development. And he and his wife raised their daughter on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. So glad you're here with us, Rick, and I can't wait to hear what you're going to teach us about today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction, Hannah, and for everything you've been doing to make this.
You too. Put so much work into it as well.
We've had a lot of cooks and no chef, and I've been grateful for you on this conference. For those of you I don't know, my name is Rick. I'm with the Center for Christian Civics, and we are in close partnership with Christians for Social Action, which is one of the sponsoring and organizing bodies for this 4-day conference that I am extremely excited about. There are basically every one of the 8 sessions coming up over the next 4 days is something I want to attend. I would encourage you all to do that as well. You can register on CMEP's website, on CSA's website, or on our website at christiancivics.org. Now, we're going to kick off this 4-day exploration of how being better Christian citizens can actually lead to a better world for our neighbors by just talking about what is citizenship and why should we engage with it? What does it mean to be part of a representative and participatory democracy from a spiritual perspective? What does Christian orthodoxy or biblical wisdom have to say about American citizenship? And the first thing we need to talk about and acknowledge is that citizenship in a representative democracy, American citizenship, is extra biblical. The biblical authors never experienced it, and kind of like laptops or live streams or cotton candy, it wasn't important enough to the history of salvation for any of the biblical authors to get any kind of what theologians might call special revelation about it. Government is not extra biblical. Government is a biblically consistent human institution. It's one of the institutions the Bible says that it's okay for humans to create and use for the common good. But the Bible doesn't prescribe a specific kind of government. It tells us that when the kingdom comes, when Jesus returns, we will be in a kingdom, under a monarchy, under Jesus's rule. But that's then, until then, whenever the Bible talks about government, it's for the most part being descriptive, not prescriptive, except for Israel after the expulsion of the Canaanites before the Babylonian exile. And when the Bible is describing human governments, it's mostly talking about variations on what we would call autocracy or monarchy, because those are the kinds of governments the biblical authors mostly lived under. And I know right here, a lot of you who are more historically minded have a big exception in mind. You're probably thinking, wait, Rome was a republic, Rome was a democracy. And yes, it was at one point. But we have to remember two things. First, when people in the US today talk about Roman democracy, if we were to look back at what it actually was and how it actually functioned, it would look to us a lot more like an aristocracy than a democracy. And that's at Rome at the height of its democracy-ness. And the second thing to bear in mind is that the height of the Roman Republic, Rome at its most democracy-ness, the kind of apex of its democratic functioning, that period when it would, to us, still look more like a aristocracy than a democracy, was existed between the Old and New Testament eras. The Old Testament authors never saw it, and it was over by the time the New Testament authors started putting pen to, well, papyrus. Chances are none of the biblical figures ever actually experienced Roman democracy. The only exception I'd say would be maybe Simeon and Anna in Luke 2, because Luke says they were already very old by the time Jesus was born. But aside from them, no, it just wasn't part of the biblical experience. See, a couple decades before Jesus was born, Julius Caesar was assassinated, which I'm sure we've all heard about at some point. And after his assassination, the Roman Senate took all of its power and authority and put it into a group called the Second Triumvirate. That was made up of Mark Antony, another person who Shakespeare wrote a play about, Marcus Lepidus, and Caesar's relative Octavius. By the time Jesus was born, that group of three people got whittled down to just one. Octavius had consolidated all of the power of the triumvirate into just himself and took on a title that most of us know him by now, Caesar Augustus, Caesar most powerful. That transition of authority from the Senate to the Second Triumvirate to Caesar Augustus was Rome's transition from a declining democracy to a functioning autocracy. The Senate still existed, but it wasn't really what it used to be. If you've ever seen the movie, it used to just be called Star Wars. Now it's called like Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, the special edition. But there's a scene in there where Darth Vader comes into a conference of most of the Empire's generals and tells them that the Emperor has just dissolved the Senate. He calls it the last vestiges of the old Republic and says that they've finally been wiped away. And at that point, the Emperor had been in power for 19 years. Everyone in the Empire knew that it wasn't really a democracy anymore. The people on Alderaan knew it. The peasants on Tatooine knew it. The Senate was still there, but it was mostly there for the sake of appearances. It was kind of hanging around out of inertia. Jesus was born just as Rome was transitioning into that same stage that the Empire was in right before Episode 4 starts. He was born as Rome was entering its window dressings of the Old Republic era. The Senate still existed in Jesus's lifetime, but the state was functioning as an autocracy. It was functioning as a monarchy, and Caesar Augustus was its head. So that's kind of the big exception. If any of you men out there are saying, what about the Roman Empire? I think about it all the time. We've thought about that too. So the biblical audiences didn't live in democracies, but then what was their relationship to government like? And how can we connect that to our role as citizens now? And we're going to look at a few different biblical eras. We're going to look at Egypt in the Old Testament era, Babylon and Persia also in the Old Testament era, and Rome after the Second Triumvirate. And they were all essentially monarchies. The authority, the identity, and the agency of the state were all tied to one person, the monarch. Then we can also look at Israel and Judah after the period of the Judges and before the Babylonian conquest and exile. And those are described in the Bible as essentially what we might call theocratic monarchies. The authority of the state was derived from the dominant religious structures, while the agency of the state was mediated through the monarch. And when we're talking about biblical era monarchs, whether they're traditional monarchs or monarchs in a theocratic monarchy, we're talking about figures like Pharaoh and Saul and David, Solomon. There's a lot about Xerxes and Darius in the Old Testament. We're talking about the various Caesars. And the monarch was generally only one person at a time, and it was a pretty sweet gig. The monarch could generally have the power and the authority to issue domestic policy unilaterally by what we would call a fiat. But that wasn't a power the monarch exercised very often, because being a monarch meant you were existing in kind of a logic trap. The authority and the legitimacy of the state rested on your office. And if that's the case, you had to make sure that your office maintained the appearance and air of legitimacy, which meant it couldn't contradict itself. It wasn't just that any one monarch couldn't contradict themselves. There was a kind of viewed as a continuity of spiritual authority in the office of the monarch. So monarchs couldn't contradict fiats given by previous monarchs. This is a big driver of the plot of the book of Esther. Xerxes wants to do something that might contradict an earlier fiat. We also see this tension playing out later on in the book of Daniel when he's in his older age. Instead of operating by fiat, monarchs would usually avoid that logic trap by, when it came to domestic policy, just setting the broad direction for it. They were usually more hands-on with foreign policy, but for domestic policy, they would set the broad direction, and then they would hire a vast network of appointed officials who would take that broad direction and turn it into specific programs. And then those programs would get executed by the appointed officials below them. So in biblical era governments, you could be a monarch. Well, one person could be a monarch, or a larger group of people could be appointed officials. And when we're talking about these kinds of appointed officials in the biblical eras, we think about like Nehemiah in the Old Testament, or Joseph and Daniel, and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, or Mordecai and Haman. In the New Testament, you've got all of the various council members and centurions and governors and tax collectors that pop in and out of the gospel stories and in and out of the book of Acts. And these people that the monarch hired would compete with each other for influence, and they would enter into a back and forth dialogue with the monarch to try to get the monarch to give them the instructions that they already wanted to implement. They were usually social climbers. They had kind of personal and political agendas, and becoming an appointed official was kind of one of the only ways you could change social classes in a lot of biblical era governments. So they were usually people who had a degree of aspirations for themselves or activist vision for their communities. So they went in to their relationship with the monarch really wanting the monarch to either elevate a group of people that they belonged to, or had some kind of reform idea that they really wanted to sell the monarch on. So they would be in these kind of, they would be competing and jockeying for influence over the monarch's thinking. The book of Esther is all about Mordecai and Esther trying to politically outmaneuver Haman, who is spending all of his time and all of his energy and all of his political capital trying to make sure that Xerxes keeps giving him the kinds of instructions that he wants to get. And the higher up on the org chart that an appointed official was, the more dangerous their job was, because that meant the closer they were to the monarch, the more scrutiny the monarch could put them under, the more closely the monarch could review their performance, and the bigger the penalties were for going off script. That's why tax collectors in the New Testament era had such a bad reputation. They were low enough on the imperial ladder that they could get away with taking some liberties here and there. They could abuse their power, collect as much as they wanted from people, as long as they were sending their prescribed quota of tributes back to Rome. The emperor didn't really care about how much more they were collecting, as long as Rome was getting its due. And that's why the stakes seemed to be so high for Haman and for Daniel. If the monarch didn't like what they had to say or what they did, or if the monarch implemented their programs and it went badly, they wouldn't just lose their job, they could be killed. I mean, in Daniel's case, literally fired. And if you weren't a monarch and you weren't hired as an appointed official, then you were by default in Egypt, in Israel, in Babylon, in Persia, and Rome, a subject. And in some ways, being a subject is kind of easy. You don't have to worry about staying informed or following issues or anything like that. But that's not really a huge comfort, because being a subject also came with a lot of vulnerability. You needed to make sure, or not make sure, you were hoping that your monarch and a critical mass of his appointed officials were both competent and benevolent at the same time. If they were good at their jobs and had good, genuine concern for the people under their rule, then life would be pretty good. You would have a stable government, a stable economy, stable relationships with your neighbors. You wouldn't have to worry as much about marauders and invaders. But if you didn't get that, and those were two hard bullseyes to line up, and if you didn't get it, you were stuck. There was nothing you could do. Things were going to go really badly for you in ways that were just completely beyond your control. Now let's compare that to life in the US today. Christians in the US today are living in a representative and participatory democracy. What do I mean by democracy? The democracy part means that citizens are ultimately responsible for government. We vote on major decisions. The representative part is representative democracies are different from direct democracies. In a direct democracy, citizens would vote on every single issue and question and law the government tries to process. The representative democracy is a democracy in which citizens vote on people who make those decisions for them by proxy. Representative democracies are places where the citizens delegate the day-to-day work of government to a smaller group of appointed officials who we hire democratically and expect to serve the interests of all the people living in their defined jurisdictions. The participatory part, because we're a representative and participatory democracy, means that even though we delegate most of the day-to-day work of government to specific people, we still have chances to vote, to participate directly in government in other ways. We can vote directly on some laws that give order and structure to our lives together. That happens mostly at the state and local level, like through ballot initiatives or state constitutional amendments. And on top of that, we have opportunities to engage in dialogue with and give feedback to the people we hire, the representatives we hire. We have the citizen lobbying process. We have recall elections. And on top of all of that, we have opportunities beyond just the processes of government to shape our communities ourselves directly in a hands-on way. You look at how many ad hoc neighborhood cleanup initiatives were organized in the Roman Empire. The number was not very high because the centurions could disperse you for unlawful assembly, versus here in my neighborhood in DC, there's like a monthly Saturday cleanup where people just every Saturday get together and decide they're going to go up and down all of the blocks collecting trash. And that's actually, trash cleanup is usually in a lot of places a government activity, but it's something the citizens can also do ourselves in a hands-on way without fear of reprisal from the government or any kind of penalty. So we can do ourselves some of the things that we sometimes rely on government for otherwise. And in the US today, if we look at kind of the roles of the monarch, the appointed officials, and the subjects in biblical era governments, they don't rest in exactly the same places. The things that the biblical authors assumed the monarch would do, or the appointed officials would do, or the subjects would do, get dispersed differently here and now. In this place, the authority, the identity, and the legitimacy of the state rests on we the people. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. Government by consent of the governed. In this place, today, those things don't rest in the monarch, the smallest part of the governmental org chart. They rest in the biggest ones, the citizens, which is a complete reversal from how the biblical authors existentially understood what government was and how it would function. Citizens do, in the various American states, have the ability to issue those domestic laws unilaterally. We have those ballot measures. We have constitutional amendments, but we don't do it very often. Not because of any kind of logic trap that we've put ourselves into, but because there's just so many of us, and we have such a well-developed political media ecosystem working to persuade us and organize us and divide us on basically every issue and question of American civic life, that it's hard to get enough of us to agree on anything in large enough numbers to get one of those kinds of fiats passed. When it comes to domestic policy, citizens set the broad direction, and then the elected officials that we hire translate that broad direction into specific policies. Those people we hire, those elected officials that we hire, are in a constant back and forth dialogue with us to get us to give them the broad direction that they want, just like the appointed officials and the monarchs in Babylon and Persia. Unlike in the biblical eras, the people who shoulder the authority, the identity, and the legitimacy of the state, we the people, are almost completely uninvolved in foreign policy. And unlike in the biblical eras, the vast majority of people have some kind of access to government. We have that ability to speak into the process. We have the freedom and agency to exercise direct influence over our neighborhoods that the biblical authors just did not have a framework for. In a public square like this, with a government that distributes agency and responsibility like this, we have to acknowledge that we are living in a circumstance that the biblical authors never had to figure out how to navigate. To Moses, to Jeremiah, to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if they looked at life in the US today, they would say that we are living on a 300 million person Pharaoh committee. And if we look at the New Testament and we just assume the same posture toward our government that Jesus's followers seem to have toward Rome, the result will always be kind of sitting around doing nothing with a persecution complex. We're always going to be envisioning the government as something outside of ourselves and actively opposed to us, instead of being in a country where the government proceeds from us and hundreds of millions of our neighbors. And the thing is, we're not in a country that's structured this way by accident. The Bible tells us that God carries his people into specific places at specific times. That means we are in a place where the government is something we are implicated in, but not the sole custodians of on purpose. That's not the way our communications ecosystems, that's not the way our political campaigns want us to think about government. Our campaigns, including people like me who worked on campaigns in the past, our parties, our pundits, our commentators, our influencers, want us to think of politics as an expression of identity, as a battle over who the soul of the country will reflect. And then they want to get us to, for lack of a better word, identify with their particular brand or team. They try to encourage us toward what I have a book right here, what H.John Hirsch describes as political hobbyism, engaging with politics not out of duty or not for the sake of pursuing someone's better interest, but engaging with politics to pursue our own emotional needs, our need for validation, our need for some kind of feeling of power or authority or a sense of security, or the feeling that we are right and good, pursuing politics for those reasons, instead of pursuing politics for the sake of influencing our communities or our countries for the common good and the love of others. Living in the United States means we are implicated in government in a unique way. Our challenge as Christians is going to be to take the responsibilities of citizenship more seriously and more respectfully than the culture we inhabit wants us to. For a lot of people, though, our first instinct when we're faced with that responsibility, when we see that God has carried us into a time and place where just by virtue of living here, we are implicated in the responsibilities of the monarch, is to say, I don't want it. I just want to follow Jesus. And that sounds nice, but here's the thing. If we follow Jesus in this country in a sincere way, it will always eventually lead us back into the public square. It just won't do it in the simplistic us versus them culture war kind of way that we see modeled for us by political professionals and political operatives. So we have about 15 minutes left. We started kind of late, so I think we're going to go to 2:50 instead of 2:45. But for the rest of our time together, for these 15 minutes, I want to just sprint through a few different ways this impulse to let powers and responsibilities go manifests itself and push back on it a little bit. And the first reason I want to talk about that Christians think about pulling out of civic life is that Paul says in Philippians 3:20 that our citizenship is in heaven, not on earth. And if we look at this verse on its own, and if we think about it like it was written by someone in the US today, then yeah, it's pretty straightforward. If Paul tweeted those exact words here and now, then no, we shouldn't get involved in civic life. We should look at this responsibility and say, I don't want to take it up. But that verse wasn't a standalone proverb, and it wasn't written here and now. If you've ever learned a second or third language, you might be familiar with the idea of a false friend or a false cognate. Those are words that sound the same in two languages, but actually point to very different ideas from one another. The comedian Tig Notaro illustrated false cognates really well in her 2011 album, Good One, where she talked about doing a tour, being on tour in, I think, Mexico, and the doorknob hanger that said "Do not disturb" said "No molestar," and she was talking about like how, you know, how secure do I feel in a hotel that needs to hang signs on the door saying "No molesting," and but actually, it's kind of okay because it's the people here who would do that can be thwarted by just hanging a sign on the door. And I can't do her act out, but she had a good one saying, not tonight. And the joke is that it's not Spanish for molestation, it's Spanish for disturbance or annoyance. When we're reading Philippians 3, citizen is a false cognate, kind of like molest is between English and Spanish. It doesn't mean the same thing to first century Romans that it does to 21st century Americans. So let's look at Philippians really quick. When we're reading Philippians 3, up until chapter 3, verse 20, Paul's letter to the church in Philippi is all about glory, validation, and security. He's writing to these people while he's under arrest. He's writing to people from arrest, from jail, from prison or house arrest, to people who care about him, who have heard about the various abuses he's suffered, and who are worried about him, who are afraid for him, and who are probably also starting to worry that the things happening to him might happen to them next. All through the letter, right up until that verse, Paul is telling his readers why it's okay for him to suffer while other people thrive. Then comes that verse, our citizenship is in heaven. And then everything after that verse is about the glory that will be revealed in him and in the people he's writing to when Christ returns, and about why that glory means they don't have to be afraid of abuse today. I've been suffering a lot, but I'm still feeling validated and secured. Our citizenship is in heaven. You and I are going to share in a great glory when Jesus returns. If citizenship means the exact same thing to Paul and his readers that it means to us, if citizenship meant to Paul and his readers that they are implicated in the authority, identity, agency, and legitimacy of government, and partially collaboratively responsible for it, then that verse is a complete non sequitur, dropped into the middle of an otherwise pretty coherent letter. But if citizenship meant something different to them than it does to us, if citizenship to them was more about safety and protection from suffering and protection from abuse, then that verse actually makes sense being dropped in that context. It wouldn't just be talking about the kinds of things we've been talking about when we talk about citizenship. And as it turns out, to people living in Rome or Roman protectorates after the Second Triumvirate, living in Rome meant that you were really vulnerable to abuse from the state unless you were a citizen. By the time of Jesus' crucifixion and Paul's conversion, a lot of people thought that living in a Roman protectorate felt kind of like we would describe a mafia protection racket today. You pay the head tax plus anything else your local tax collector wanted from you, and the centurions won't harass you. If you don't pay, well, I can't promise you what they're going to do when my back is turned. Sure would be bad if these centurions left their pikes there and you fell on it 17 or 18 times when no one was looking. Roman citizenship was a civic status that afforded you a greater degree of protection and freedom within the jurisdictions of the Roman Empire. If you were a citizen, you weren't supposed to have to fear that kind of abuse. That's the dynamic we see at play in the book of Acts in chapters 16 and 22 and 25, when Paul invokes his Roman citizenship as a reason that the centurions can't give him a hard time for being a little bit of a rabble rouser. He understands that his citizenship in Rome provides him with a degree of privilege and a degree of protection from the abuses of the Roman state. He's not talking about citizenship as something that makes it seem like he has authority in the state or any kind of responsibility in it or toward it or stakeholder in it. He's talking about it as something that affords him protection from the abuses of the world around him. By the time he's writing his letter, Paul has been suffering abuses at the hands of the Roman state, despite his citizenship. So when he says, I've been suffering these things, but I'm still rejoicing because my citizenship is in heaven and I don't have to fear these people, he's not saying my chances to put my hands to the wheel of government and affect change in the community around me is in heaven. He's saying, even when my worldly protection from abuse fails, our God in heaven gives me a greater assurance of an even greater protection. So I'm not worried about what's happening to me, and you shouldn't be worried if it happens to you. Citizen in Philippians 3 to people living in the US, it's a false cognate. Same word, very different meaning. Another argument I've heard for why Christians shouldn't be a part of civic life or why we shouldn't feel compelled to take up those responsibilities is that we shouldn't participate in any government that doesn't recognize Jesus as its head of state, any government that's not a Christian theocracy. Now, we're not in a Christian theocracy. Christians in the US are living in a state that is religiously pluralist. Being a legitimate part of our country and being able to participate equally in our institutions does not require commitment to a specific faith or tradition. And we're being asked, by virtue of being citizens, to be part of the monarch committee for that kind of country. We're being asked to take part in the powers, privileges, and responsibilities that in the biblical eras would have belonged just to the monarch. So what are we going to do? Do we accept that offer or not? The Bible doesn't offer a clear, direct answer to that question because the biblical authors didn't have a precedent for the work of the Pharaoh being done by 300 million people together instead of just one person or three people. But it does give us quite a few examples of what God's people do when they have to navigate some kind of political authority and responsibility in a pagan monarchy. We see Joseph in Egypt, which had a state religion. We see Daniel and his friends and Esther and Mordecai in Babylon and Persia, where you had to exclusively worship the state gods and their appointed leader on penalty of death. And we see a number of converts in the Roman Empire where you were free to worship whatever regional gods you wanted, as long as you worshiped the empire above them, which was a big no-no for people whose regional god claimed to be the God above all gods and king above all kings. So what wisdom can we take away from believers in those circumstances? Well, one of my favorite passages early on in my Christian life is actually about someone with authority in the Roman Empire, and it would seem to support this argument that Christians should just withdraw from a government if it's not a Christian theocracy. In the book of Luke, we see the tax collector Levi, who was called Matthew because Jesus was bad with names, I guess, who was sitting in his tax booth collecting taxes. And when Jesus saw him, he said, "Follow me." And Levi got up, left everything, and followed Jesus. He renounced his pagan political responsibilities completely. But he's the exception to the pattern. In Scripture, most people who have some kind of responsibility in a government, even a pagan theocracy, don't get called to abandon that responsibility when they start to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They just start handling that responsibility differently. One of my favorite people in all of Scripture is one of Levi's colleagues, Zacchaeus. In Luke 19, Zacchaeus experiences the good news and he responds to it by remaining a tax collector. But he changes the way he approaches his work. Before he met Jesus, Zacchaeus abused his authority and used it for his own good. After he met Jesus, he doesn't just confess his sin and pay back what he stole. He goes much, much farther than that. He starts making sacrificial reparations, giving back 4 times more to people than he had defrauded. The New Testament also gives us the faithful centurion, who's a military commander, Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member of the local council, Nicodemus, who's a member of the Pharisees, and they all have these life-changing encounters with Jesus, and they all keep their position, and none of them are chastised by Jesus for it. And this isn't just a New Testament pattern, it's an Old Testament pattern as well. This kind of thing happens with Naaman from 2 Kings, who serves the king of Aram in modern-day Syria, who was the king, the person Naaman served, was physically feeble. And Naaman's job was literally to go with the king into the temple of this foreign god and put his arm around the king's shoulders and physically bow down before this foreign idol with the king and then help the king stand back up again. He was like the king's cane or exoskeleton. And Naaman comes to worship the God of Israel and he asks the prophet Elisha, and that is Elisha, not Elijah. I don't know if any of you have as hard a time with that as I do. Elisha. He asked that prophet, I should leave this job, right? And Elisha told him, no, don't leave your job. If we're trying to figure out what to do with the powers and privileges and obligations and responsibilities and even vulnerabilities that come along with sharing a representative democracy with a lot of people who don't share our faith, but still get represented by the government, then the vast majority of biblical examples of people in similar situations, of people who have some kind of tie to or obligation to a non-Christian government, from Joseph and Daniel in the Old Testament to the faithful centurion and my boy Zacchaeus in the New Testament, the vast majority of those biblical examples are telling us to take up that responsibility, but put in the work to bear that responsibility in a more honorable, compelling, and even a more generous way than the people around us would expect. One more objection that I want to look at, looking at the time. Yeah, I think we have time to cover. There are 2 more we could do. 3 minutes, I'm going to just do one of them. The last objection I want to get to today is just a practical one, because this conference is going to end with a very practical training about how to take time out of what to do if you take time out of your day to go actually do some civic advocacy work, some political advocacy work. And there's a really practical objection to that a lot of people raise. There we go. Can you all still hear me? I hope so. It's that being engaged in civic life takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. The kind of work that goes into the American style of citizenship, learning about our neighbors and their needs, their concerns, figuring out how we can use whatever powers or privileges or responsibilities we might have to address those concerns, takes research and commitment, and we're all busy people. We're tired, we're exhausted. If we have any free time, shouldn't we just be spending it on things that have to do with God instead of things that have to do with government? And yeah, I mean, that makes sense if you, hold on, let's microphone there. And yeah, that does make some sense. But if we're following Jesus and we make obeying him and imitating him our highest priority, then we are going to end up back in the public square in the US. The Old Testament tells us that God was planning to send us a redeemer because he heard our cries. He heard humanity crying into the void, and the things we were crying about provoked his sympathy. Jesus says that all of Scripture is about him. And when you read through the prophets, yes, you do see them talking about how people order their worship and their devotional lives, how they manage their families. But you also see the prophets talking about prejudice, about abuse of social, political, and cultural power. You see them talking about public health, about just and unjust economic practices, about judicial processes and legal protections, food distribution, immigration, economic inequality, just war, and so many more topics that we would think of as political today. These things are all part of the painful cry for deliverance that the prophets articulated on behalf of humanity. These things are part of the reason Jesus came to us and part of the reason he is bringing a better kingdom. All of these things are also the same things that push our neighbors into the public square. They're the reasons people pursue political change or proximity to political power. If we're following Jesus, we cannot be above understanding, talking about, and getting involved with these things that might at first glance seem worldly to us if we grew up with some kind of sacred secular divide. These things should be important to those of us who call Jesus the author and perfecter of our faith. Withdrawing from civic life sends a message to our neighbors that we think our faith somehow places us above sharing in their brokenness and their suffering. When our whole faith is about that one moment in history when the God who actually was above our brokenness and our suffering subjected himself to it alongside us anyway, so that he could give us some degree of relief now as a foretaste of the even greater relief and hope that will be coming in the future. If we tell ourselves that investing in the systems and institutions that shape our neighbors' lives, that learning about and doing something about the kinds of things that send the people around us into the public square is somehow inherently a distraction from knowing, loving, and following the God of the Bible, then we are fooling ourselves, and our actions make us out to be lying about Jesus to the people around us who he is trying to reach through us. With that said, I hope that you will consider coming back to more of the sessions this week. Hannah's going to give you a little bit more of an update on what's happening later today and where you can learn and hear more, this again, or share this video with other friends. And yeah, again, we're going to, from the rest of our time here, talk about how we go into the public square in a range of ways on a range of issues, ending with, again, that really practical training. Hannah, I'll hand it back to you to do the outro and highlight what people should be looking for and doing next.
All right. Thank you so much, Rick. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed learning just about what it looks like and the call for us to be active citizens. Tonight, I hope you all come back at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Pacific. My daughters have a hard time with that word, and apparently I do too. 5 p.m. Pacific time to hear Rob Dalrymple and David Crump talk about theology of empire and Christian nationalism. I think it's going to be fantastic. And then tomorrow, Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon will be joining us to talk about the Middle East, and she is fire, and her session will be fantastic. And we have so many sessions about justice and single issue voting and advocacy. So come and join us for all the ones that you're available for. And if you can't watch the sessions at the time that we stream them live, they will be available on the Network for Evangelicals for the Middle East's YouTube page, like their live stream page. Also, the Center for Christian Civics and Christians for Social Action. And then if you want to find out more information, we have a Facebook page that you can go check out. And if you just happen to have caught this and you haven't registered for our event, you can go to this link and register for the event. And then we'll be able to send you follow-ups, send you the videos of the sessions that you missed, clips, highlights, all of those things. So thank you all so much for being with us. We look forward to being with you later today and for the next 4 days. Thank you all.